figure this out. I also want to encourage everybody. I'm glad we have it up. But I also want to encourage everybody during the talk, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask Emilia, there is a Q&A section at the top of the screen, and feel free to ask any questions that you like in there. All right, thanks, Emilia. Take it away.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
So this is just to present the project, and we have a website. I can send a link for that with a lot of resources up there. But it's a project that aims to explore healing from the perspective of those who give, receive, and evaluate healing. And it does so in the hope of helping to provincialize Euro-American biomedical evaluations of healing and well-being. Provincializing is a term that comes to us from the Decolonial Register, and it really means taking Europe out of the center of the world as the sole arbitrator of what counts as proper healing. And we see that a lot of the ways in which these sacred plants are evaluated at the moment is in terms of this reference point in Europe. So to do this, we're trying to think about how this is operating differentially across 3 different sites, which are healing in the forest, in the lab, and in the city. And we have a set of comparative, we've structured the analysis around these 3 transversal encounters, which you see represented here, or at least I hope you do. And they are material semiotic encounters, which really aims to map the entanglement of biological and social effects in the different healing practices that we're looking at. The second one is encounters beyond the human, or human-plant encounters, as they're referenced to here. And this was really about thinking within the field of social sciences about how we can recognize plants and non-human beings as social actors in their full right. Anthropology and social theory has tended to be very anthropocentric, to not be able to really grasp more than human agencies. So this is something we're grappling with in this particular aspect. And then the final one is ontological encounters. And ontology is a Ponzi word for ways of making reality. And so we're looking at trying to find ways to recognize this multiplicity of ways of being in the world, of ontologies, within what we feel is very important to render as a common world. Sometimes the ontological position pushes into viewing there as multiple worlds, and I think it's very important politically that we recognize that we share one world with a huge diversity of ways of being within that world. And that's obviously a big political challenge. So on this project, I work with Silvia Misturini, who some of you might know. She was participating in the first Plantas Sagradas conference, Piera Tallin, who is working in the city, and Camis Benedito, who presented yesterday on the panel on Brazilian clinical research. And the aim of our project really is to think about healing beyond the individualistic frame that is so common in Western settings. And we like to think about healing as it comes to encompass questions of food sovereignty, right to territory, to access to clean water and clean air. And as a team, we've been concerned with the complex layered entanglements of ayahuasca and colonialism. And we attend to the way settler colonial tactics continue to extract plants and knowledges from their multi-species web of relations. So we did not seek out to decolonize ayahuasca research so much as to think principally because we were well aware that that would be rather nonsensical within the context of the academy and the institutional setting that we're both supported and constrained by. And when I initially wrote the grant in 2016, the central anti-colonial ideas within the grant were to not treat Indigenous voices as standing in for a timeless tradition, but rather to situate them within the ongoing violence of colonialism and extractivism, and to experiment with the limits of anthropological theory and social theory more generally, and its capacity to take seriously other ways of knowing and being in the world. And then finally, to think about what it can mean to engage in good relations, one could say reciprocal relations, in worlds that are marked by ongoing structural violence, inequality, and extractivism. And I think this is really about apprehending the profound contradiction that I see in creating spaces for healing that do not directly address the question of the ongoing violence of colonialism and racism. So these objectives are subtly, but I'd like to say importantly, different to decolonizing ayahuasca research. Now, I propose that we turn to some of the critiques of this idea of the excessive use of the concept of decolonization. And a core reference here is a text published in 2012 by Tuck and Yang called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, which I refer to in the abstract of the paper. And I'll perhaps just say here that if I've created a little bibliography with some PDFs, links to PDFs for all the references that I'm going to give here. So I'm happy to share that with anyone after. Just reach out and I can forward you that list of references if it's interesting for you. So in this particular text, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, Tuck and Yang state, and I quote from their text, "The language of decolonization has been superficially adopted into the social sciences, supplanting prior ways of talking about social justice, critical methodologies, or approaches which decenter settler perspectives." And they refer to this as a domestication of decolonization that, I quote, "recenters whiteness, resettles theory, and extends innocence to the settler by entertaining a settler future," end of quote. So in this view, decolonization is ultimately about innocenting white people from their involvement in and profiting from ongoing colonial orders. And they see this as a hollow academic rebranding that does not partake in actually changing the rules of the game. Now, this strand of decolonial theory holds that the term decolonial should actually be reserved for action that works to bring about a decolonized future. And until we're able and willing to decolonize the structures that we're all benefiting from, we need other words for what we're actually doing. So I think this is a really important provocation and one that we take very seriously in the project. So bringing about such structural change within the academy can take a variety of forms, and it can look like hiring Indigenous people or people from marginalized communities, or holding space within the academy for other ways of knowing, and also acknowledging the challenge of coming into this space for people who haven't had access to it historically. And a lot of invisible work goes on here in terms of changing the institution's contract forms of engagement outside the academy, for example. And for us as a project, we're definitely doing a lot of work in this slightly invisible space of confronting the tacit colonial and one could say imperial violence. I mean, I'm working from France, that is written into the bureaucracy of our institutions. Now, Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano refers to 4 domains that are entangled in what he calls the colonial matrix of power. And these are the control of the economy, like labor or natural resources, the control of authority, here institutions play an important role, the control of gender and sexuality, families, reproduction, sexuality, and the control of subjectivity and knowledge, which has everything to do with the way in which subjectivity is formed, education, and epistemology. And it's interesting that Latin American and Caribbean intellectuals like Eduardo Villegas de Castro, Sylvia Cusicanqui, Sylvia Winter, Aimé Césaire, Fanon, Glissant have focused a great deal of their critical attention on decolonizing knowledge, pointing to the way colonial conceptual orders and grammars deeply shape human subjectivities and understandings of what it is to be in relation. Now, the history of Western science can be told as the history of how a very peculiar form of knowing was forged and then leveraged for the extraction and accumulation of other people's resources. And this has meant using Western knowledge as the single yardstick with which to measure the value of every other form of knowledge, and transforming science into a kind of normative institutional space that polices the boundary between legitimate knowledge and something else that might be called belief. But we see how this transformation of science is historical and political. And knowledge and colonialism continue to go hand in hand. The complicity of universities with colonial forms of knowledge acquisition, transmission, and financialization is ongoing, and something that many people are fighting at the moment. Before we went into lockdown here in France, we had been on a long strike within the university, one of the most important university strikes. And this is something that's happening across the US, in Britain, in many places. So this neoliberalization of the university is about the pressure for academics to find funding via public-private partnerships, famously known as PPPs, to develop intellectual property, the emphasis on venture capital and incentives to develop startups. These are all things that figure in our evaluation criteria as academics. And more prosaically, in the general resistance within universities to other forms of knowledge. So this is not something that's in the past, and this is something that there's a tension within universities around these questions that's very acute at the moment. And so this point, of course, is very true for disciplines in the social sciences, like anthropology, but also for the way knowledge about plants is constructed within the life sciences. And on this, I highly recommend Monica Gagliano's book, Thus Spoke the Plant, because she really engages with the political aspect of this question as well. So one of the first definitions of epistemicide that I came across is by Boaventura de Sousa Santos in 1998, and he designates as epistemicide the murder of knowledge. And Western knowledge was literally built out of this epistemicide, this systematic rendering extinct of certain types of knowledge, of otherwise knowledges. And this epistemicide renders non-Western societies incapable of representing the world in their own terms as they encounter the West. And here lies a deep problem of non-reciprocity, to which I want to return to in a moment. Now, a core way that structural change can be brought about by decolonial endeavors, decolonial thinkers tell us, is ensuring that land is put back into Indigenous stewardship. And where the conversation we are gathered around here is concerned, I understand this to mean that the use of sacred plants cannot be decolonized while the territories on which these plants depend are not. And this is something that Indigenous people tirelessly, patiently remind the international psychedelic community. Plants come with their worlds, and these worlds must be defended. To give a citation from Umiyak, who is present here at the conference, they produced a very potent declaration on cultural appropriation, which I encourage everyone to read. And this reaffirms, and I quote from the declaration, "Today we are still suffering from colonization, invasion, armed groups, drug traffickers, land grabbers, mining, hydrocarbon multinationals, timber traffickers, cattle ranchers, continue to threaten the survival of our people, guardians of Amazonian ecosystems. With Yahé, we heal the illnesses of communities and protect our territories." End of quote. So decolonization is often understood to mean returning the land to Indigenous ownership. But if we read this literature closely, we can see that decolonial thinkers are actually asking us to question the very notion that land can be owned. US-based Native Studies, American Studies scholar Andrea Smith puts it in these terms: "The presumption of land as property makes invisible alternative conceptions of land as a relative that does not stand in sharp distinction to the human. Before there can be the theft of land, land as something that can be taken must be created." So this is as much a call for white settler society to relinquish land as it is a call to eradicate the notion of land as extractable, sellable, and mineable. And there are very complex positions that are held here in relation to the nation state. For some decolonial thinkers or Indigenous organizations, there can be no decolonial future while settler nations remain in place. And this is a very complex question, while others do not situate themselves against the state in this way. So, for example, the declaration of the third Indigenous Ayahuasca conference that was held in October 2019 on Ashinanka territory explicitly articulates the need for international and state-level mechanisms of environmental protection and calls on state and supranational agencies to halt the illegal actions of loggers, hunters, agro-industry, miners, and projects such as dams or roads into Indigenous territories. Another core tension here lies in the relative place that non-Indigenous, non-settler communities come to occupy in relation to decolonial struggles and the provincialization of Western knowledge. Is decolonization solely about Indigenous people? This is a question that we come across in the literature. Or do other marginalized groups and silenced groups come to count in this debate? And if so, how? How are questions of Blackness thought alongside questions of indigeneity? And how does this vary across the colonized territories of the Americas and beyond? Is the critique of Eurocentricism, imperialism, capitalism, nationalism, patriarchy, sexism, racism the same as decoloniality? Charlene Carruthers, in a beautiful book called Unapologetic, a Black queer feminist mandate for radical movements, asks, and I quote from her, "What claim do Black Americans have to the land Native peoples call Turtle Island? What claim to indigeneity? Processes of colonization, forced migration, and enslavement have stripped us," and here she's speaking as a Black person, "from our land. It is anti-Black," she says, "to say that that after more than 300 years, we have no claim to steward this land. Stewardship, not extractive ownership, should be our North Star," end of quote. Sylvia Kusikanki is a vociferous concerning the co-optation of some Indigenous forms of leadership by sexist, patriarchal colonial forms, and she urges us not to be naive about what the state can offer, but nor to simply reject the state. She lays bare the complex terrain of class, ethnic, cultural, and sexual politics. She calls for a decolonization of the very notion of indigeneity and of gender in their essentialist constructions, freeing them of the colonial imaginary in which they are reckoned always in relation to rights and to the state. Representation for Kusikanski also means honoring Indigenous wisdom and tradition beyond vacuous or overgeneralized representations of Indigenous people's relationship to nature. Now, my sense reading the decolonial literature is that there are substantial differences between North and Latin American threads of these debates, perhaps most notably in relation to the category of the mestizo and the distinct histories of alliances and/or conflicts between Indigenous and Black communities across the continent. And what is at stake, in my view, is a true reckoning with multiplicity beyond the neat categories of Native, Black, and White. Settler colonial strategies are concerned, I think, with erasing difference in the world. This renders the world unsafe for human difference, to paraphrase Ruth Benedict, the anthropologist. In this sense, to decolonize must necessarily imply to refuse the existent categories we are served as either or, and to push our imagination beyond the registers that colonialism has forged so deeply in our subjectivity. And this means having very difficult conversations about how difference can coexist in relation to the common projects that we set ourselves to create in the ruins of the nation state as it was imagined in the processes of independence. Maybe we need another idea of the state, or maybe we do need to get rid of the state. This is a very profound question, I think. In one of the latest episodes of a beautiful podcast series that I really highly recommend called How to Survive the End of the World, Autumn Brown explicitly links the iconic Octavia Butler parable quote, and I've put it here, "All that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you," The only lasting truth is change. Now, I can't go into very much of the context of this, but it's the basis of a religion that Octavia Butler's character Lauren Olumina founds. And so referring to this profound sentence or piece of wisdom, Autumn Brown notes that what makes colonization is that a colonizer changes others, changes the world, but does not want to be changed in response. And this points to a deep question, because this wisdom recognizes that change is actually inevitable, but that as Lauren Olumina's Earthseed verses go, we can actively change and shape change. We can actually shape change. And the question I think we're all confronted with in this moment is how willing are we to change, and where are we willing to take risks to change? So now I want to turn more explicitly to how all of this pertains to the topic that brings us together, to this question of sacred plants, and to the work that we're doing in the Healing Encounter team. So working from within the academy and from Europe, we find ourselves confronted with the very peculiar challenge of undoing the pernicious coloniality of knowledge, as Aníbal Quijano puts it, from within. What does it mean to bridge knowledges from here? To imagine this dialogue in the wake of the violence of ongoing epistemicide and denial of other ways of knowing and being in the world? In a sense, the question is does it even make sense to attempt this from within the academy? Now, within the context of the Forest sub-project, we're collaborating with two Indigenous organizations, one Shipibo in Peru and one Huniquin in Brazil. And these collaborations have sought to break with more classical anthropological research that aim to catalog Indigenous plant knowledge. Instead, what we've sought to do is to open a space for dialogue about the consequences of extractivism and colonial violence for the possibility of maintaining a relational way of knowing. Building bridges between these knowledges means recognizing that the naturalistic worldview, the view that is held by biology or the natural sciences, for example, is neither the only one nor the truest one. And I believe that it's not enough to include an Indigenous perspective within this Western knowledge. For the encounter between knowledges to be actually respectful or reciprocal, Western institution must be transformed by the encounter. And we can see the profound resistance, both disciplinary and institutional, that exists to this transformation. Now here we have put emphasis on co-constructing the inquiry with our collaborators, rather than arriving with predefined questions. And we plan to co-author the work that comes out of these exchanges and have invited two Indigenous people to form part of our scientific and ethical advisory board. Now, within the context of the lab sub-project, we are collaborating with colleagues from Icaro in Brazil, and you will have heard some of them presenting yesterday. So this collaboration is aiming to produce a cartography of the psychedelic research that's conducted in Brazil at the moment, to map its relation and specificity in relation to Europe and North American research. And this is part of our agenda of provincializing this excessive focus on Euro-American practices. Now, it's my sense that the wisdom that plants bring is profoundly mysterious. And truly recognizing this requires of the sciences that they allow themselves to be transformed. In this sense, my purpose is to analyze to what extent the academy is capable of letting itself be transformed. In the wake of COVID, and we've seen growing rejection of science and biomedicine, as conspirituality has reached new heights amongst alternative healing and ecologically minded circles. And it seems to me that we're in a critical moment in the history of humanity in which it's necessary to both deeply reckon with science's imperialistic legacy and heritage without rejecting science. What practices of science after epistemicide are needed to foster social justice and regeneration, we could ask? There are many forces leveraged by social media in the interest of big business and with the backing of neo-fascist administrations that are throwing discredit on the process of knowing in common. But more than ever, it seems, we need to renew our ways of knowing in common, of collaborating in how we know, of ensuring that the knowledge thus shared can bring about technologies that are open source and widely accessible to all. So to conclude, I want to return to the conference theme of reciprocity. Reciprocal is defined as that which is mutually exchanged, and it's important to honor reciprocity, but to untether it from liberal forms of recognition. By this, I mean that simply including others within the existent framework is not reciprocity. Reciprocity of the kind that is demanded of us right now means yielding to deep change. Visionary fiction writer Walida Imarisha reminds us, and I quote from her, "The decolonization of the imagination is the most dangerous and subversive form there is, for it is where all other forms of decolonization are born. Once the imagination is unshackled, liberation is limitless." Where sacred plants are concerned, this means attending to the infinitely creative ways that plants and humans cultivate each other. Can we acknowledge the unique and deep ways that Indigenous peoples partner with plants without congealing the liveliness of these relationships to the past? Without excluding or labeling as incomplete the plant knowledges of displaced or enslaved communities? Without being mesmerized by molecular accounts of plant efficacy? Without giving plants up to proprietary regimes? And without falling for the idea that without patents, we cannot scale up plant medicines to those who need them. So finally, I'd like to return to the term otherwise of my original title. The otherwise has been defined as something or anything else to what currently is. It also holds the idea of in a different way. And here I'm referring to how important the how of transformative work is. The taking care of, the dwelling in, the staying with the trouble. And this invites the creation of new or perhaps very old kinds of spaces and dialogues in which process, not outcome, is key, in which not knowing is welcome. Spaces that allow a slowing down to happen, in which more can be embraced, in which conflicting views can be respectfully held, such that we can collectively reckon with the harm that has been done and ensure that the something else that we're moving towards, that emerges, can be safe for difference, particularly for those who have been systematically harmed up until now. And I think I'm drawn to this framework because it speaks deeply about a mode of struggle and collective imagination that is not just against, but powerfully orientated towards something otherwise. Thank you very much.
Wonderful presentation, Emilia. Thank you so much for sharing your research with all of us. I have one question that came to mind while I was listening. I have listened in on a few conversations of researchers who would like to conduct some ayahuasca assisted therapy research to help people heal from all kinds of mental health conditions. So, and from what I've heard, I've seen that their understanding of reciprocity is actually quite limited. And it seems that their understanding of reciprocity is only transactional. Like, I will give you money for the knowledge that you give. Is that reciprocity? And I would also like to loop that in with a general question of what, if you can please simply define reciprocity.
Wow, that's I can't answer that question in the absolute. I think what you're pointing to is really important. This transactional reciprocity is, I mean, the question is, do Indigenous communities want that? And what space do they have as actors in this debate to actually discuss what kind of form reciprocity can take? I'm not going to stand here and say this is appropriate or not appropriate. And I think there's a lot of debate about the Nagoya Convention for Biodiversity and whether or not these forms of benefit sharing that can be produced out of, for example, if a patent is developed out of indigenous knowledge, there is a transactional kind of reciprocity that is legally available. We know from the work that is out there that it's very seldom being actually activated in any kind of satisfactory way. But I don't think it's my role to say whether or not that is correct or sufficient. I think that the question of reciprocity, I wanted to stretch it a little bit further into this direction, because really where I'm standing is within this deep contradiction and paradox of asking these questions from within academia. And I feel like one of the ways in which we can be reciprocal, and perhaps it's not sufficient, I mean, it's obviously not sufficient, but it's a step that we're taking, is to try and see how we can actually allow this change and transformation to operate and be part of that work. So I think there's many different ways for reciprocity to happen. And I think the core answer I would give is that it's down to different communities to articulate, and we need spaces in which people can say, whether they think this is sufficient and appropriate and not, and where we can take action on the basis of these responses.
Great, thank you so much. And Anna Flesha is asking, do you know of any examples of anti-colonial universities?
Oh, that's a great question. I wish I did. I do know of one initiative that is being led by Max Leboireau in Canada, and I can post a link to that. I don't know if they call it a university. There's also this term, the pluriversity, because we can see that even in the notion of the university, there is only one world represented, and perhaps what we need is precisely no longer a university, but many versities. But thank you for that great question.
Yeah. So also with Anna Flesha, and you kind of talked more about it in the project of what decolonial practices in the academy can look like. But more specifically, what could anti-colonial futures look like for universities? And I know you kind of talked about it when the interaction between Indigenous communities and the university, it's necessary for the university to transform into anti-coloniality or decoloniality. So what would your opinions be for the futures of universities?
Plurality, multiplicity, collective spaces where we can imagine different ways. I'm seeing the comments arising here. This book by Maria Betania, we've been trying to get hold of it. I'm aware that this is a really important reference. And thank you, Keith, for the addition to Institute. That was the institution I was looking for. There's many, I think that the question is less what could we do? These things are actually happening. There are hundreds of incredible grassroots organizations that have taken it upon themselves to transmit and curate all sorts of different forms of knowledge. So I'm not concerned so much about the fact that this isn't already happening. I think it's more a question of making sure that funding arrives to these amazing initiatives that are happening, and that they have the proper recognition and sort of structural support to conduct their work. And I think there has to be, I think, if there's anything I would like people to take away from my talk today, is that it has to be multiple. It cannot be one solution, one size fits all. And again, there's a reference that came up in the chat to the monocultures of the mind, Vandana Shiva's work. And I think this is one way we can really think about colonialism as wanting to homogenize. And so anything that pluralizes and is rhizomic and multiplies is a powerful response to that.
Thanks, Emilia. And I'm going to move on to another question with Camilla Rosselli. How do you see the relationship between Western science and epistemicide in environmental movements and conservation projects in the Amazon? Do you think it's possible to decolonialize this field?
I hope it is. I think I was very moved by Monica Gagliano's book because she refers to Thus Spoke the Plant. In the end, she refers to this revolution that she's partaking in around plants, and recognizing within biomedical sciences that plants can be thought of as sentient beings, as having relationality, as learning, all these different things that she's partaken in demonstrating experimentally. And she concludes the book by saying that there's a parallel revolution taking place, which is the GMO revolution, which is a monocultural of plants revolution, which is an intensification of this, reductionism and just destruction really of diversity, and that we need to be really conscious of that. It's quite paradoxical that in the context of the attention globally that's given to plants at the moment in the life sciences, there are these two parallel views that are really taking things in opposite directions, and it's not clear. It's not clear what will happen. I think the more we believe that we can, decolonize, the more we will be able to actually invest energy in that direction. And the more, speaking for myself, the more hopeless I get, the less I am able to move. So perhaps that's one strand of reflection to have around this.
Yeah, I'm just an early student in decolonization methodologies, and it's challenging for me to, see the breadth of the possibilities that decolonial practices or anti-colonial practices could be implemented in universities, and specifically within the field of anthropology as well. In our earlier conversation this week, we spoke about how the legacy of anthropology has been colonial in many ways, and so with more modern academia, we have this question come up more and more in the conversations, which is very important and necessary. And so I also think about the indigenous people who live this experience, and how there needs to be more indigenous researchers to be doing this work. But I am also thinking about the lack of access that many indigenous people experience, who would love to go to education or to pursue education, but are just unable to. So do you have any thoughts of that?
My main thought is that the disciplines need Indigenous people as much as I think Indigenous people would like to have access. I think it's, the discipline of anthropology, to speak just of the discipline that I occupy, is going to die a very sorry death if it doesn't, really transform itself. It has this dark history, and I think it's a fascinating discipline. There are people within the discipline who are arguing for, just let it burn, just let it die. There's nothing we can salvage here. And I hear these arguments, and I think there's a lot there to pay attention to. I haven't yet left. Maybe that's naive on my part. I don't know. But I do think that we're in a very unique moment in history. I believe that the change that's coming is just going to accelerate, and I also feel like there's a lot of people who are ready for this change and who are working this change in the institutions and beyond. And so, yes, making access, giving people access is absolutely fundamental. I'm just very sad about what's happening in Brazil, where we saw the potency of the quota system to bring people into the public university system in Brazil. And one of the first things that Bolsonaro did was repudiate that. And the impact is dramatic. So yes, giving structural forms of access is vital.
And then I think we have time for either one or two questions. And I'm going to ask Sarah Barbosas, what do you think are the challenges to bring this intercultural models into public health?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Okay, so I think public health is already deeply intercultural, right? I mean, public health is touching down on in many different localities and confronting many different worldviews. So, you know, when we have, say, a nutrition policy or a sexual and reproductive health type policy, it's launched out of, you know, the World Health Organization or sort of international kind of agreements and then they travel and they touch base in different localities of the world where people are, you know, confronting these ideas of the body and illness and wellness from very different perspectives. And there's this endless question in public health about why is this not scalable? Why are these interventions not working? Why are people not adhering to treatments? And the simple reason is because these things cannot scale and travel without deep attention to what's happening contextually, locally, to local understandings of the environment and local biologies, as Margaret Locke refers to them. So the challenges are just letting go of this idea that we can scale up models. And, you know, the Gates Foundation has been absolutely instrumental in, you know, instituting even more deeply this idea that if you have a program, it needs to be scalable and it needs to be worked in with metrics that are just going to demonstrate its efficacy across the world as if locality didn't matter. So I think if we just began by letting go of the idea that things could be scaled, we would overcome a lot of problems.
Great answer. So I will also bring attention to Robert Heffernan's question. Isn't plurality and acknowledging multidimensional perspectives an outgrowth of modernist inquiry?
That's
And he also, and he also quoted Mbembe, the Western archive is singularly complex. It contains within itself the resources of its own reputation. It is neither monolithic nor the exclusive property of the West.
Yes, I think that's a really deep point, and I would make a distinction between plural and multiple. And I think the idea of the plural is that there is one whole, one world, as represented by one group's vision or one group's construction of what this whole is, and then you can cut that into sort of plural perspectives and you can sort of fit everyone in. So this is the idea of multiculturalism, for example. It's actually a plural view of the world in which if you sort of had everyone's perspective, you could sort of come together with a whole vision that would be somehow a totality. And I think that's a problem, this view. And instead we need a view of multiplicity. And multiplicity actually is there's so much difference in the different perspectives that are held together that they're constantly interrupting each other. And what's required to hold a multiplicity together as opposed to a plurality together is a constant space of listening and dialogue. And that's a lot of work, and that requires spaces of consensus that are obviously going to get co-opted by power. That's what's happened throughout history. But I think we need to continue to strive towards holding multiple wholes, which are not wholes really. We need another kind of vocabulary to understand that. And I think we also just need to really construct spaces where we can have the difficult conversations and we can lean into the challenge that they pose and have structures to do that. And building those is actually a really essential part of the work we need to do, I think.
Thank you. And we have 1 more minute before the talk is over. Do you have any last remarks?
Just thank you for all these great comments, and I'm seeing so many references pop up here on the chat that I want to delve into after. And yes, thank you. Sorry for the slide problem at the beginning.
It's all great. Technical issues happen. So thank you everyone for joining us. I would also encourage everyone to come network. I believe Emilia will has the option to be in the networking space to speak with all of you and answer any of your questions. And thank you, and I hope you guys have a really amazing conference.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Bye. Thank you.